Wow, what will they think of next? Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam. I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 39 years and then some. Recently, I published a video about using smartphones to help us monitor our multiple sclerosis between doctor visits. And it turns out that was just the tip of the iceberg, as you probably aren't surprised to hear. More and more of this kind of thing is coming out, a very good thing, because MS is not the kind of disease that sends you running to the doctor constantly. You learn to live with the symptoms. The doctor gives you insight in what's causing them and what you might be able to do about them. By and large, we see our doctors, regular basis, but maybe a couple of times a year, maybe more frequently if you have certain kinds of medications and you need monitoring. I see my doctor once a year, maybe. And so I've thought, well, that's pretty nice if there's a way that the data could be collected so that when I do see my doctor, they're a little bit better informed. But as I said, this is only the beginning. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this kind of thing going on. And so what I'd like to do is share with you a couple of articles about technologies that are in process right now to assist with data collection for multiple sclerosis, getting patients more involved in their own care, which is wonderful. But then I will also share an article that I found in the New England Journal of Medicine that just kind of gives an overview of the challenges and issues that remain to be addressed as these new technologies become more widespread and more acceptable to patients and doctors alike. Also in multiple sclerosis news today, it's called Smartphone Wearable Device Data Found Reliable to Monitor MS Study. And then the subtitle is Findings Show Exciting Possibilities for Real-Life Disease Management. Article was published on March 28th of 2024. Measurements from smartphones and wearable devices like smartwatches can reliably provide clinically meaningful data to monitor multiple sclerosis, a new study from Switzerland reports. While daily data from such devices did not prove sufficiently reliable in this small study, information generated weekly across more than 45 different measures to monitor MS did in fact meet consistency criteria. And as I read that, I'm thinking, well, that is so true in a way, because day to day, MS might look very different. But week to week, perhaps the patterns repeat enough or are consistent enough that you might get something useful out of it. They go on to say, moreover, some data automatically generated over time from wearable devices was more reliably collected than information culled from patients having to open an application or app, the study found. That makes also very good sense, because remembering to open an app or having the motivation to open an app, those can vary greatly with anybody, and certainly with someone with MS. That's just not going to be top of mind for the most part. So if it can be collected passively without any triggering event from the patient, that might be the best. And they say that these findings have the potential to be used by medical researchers and clinicians for the design and development of wearable-based tools for MS disease monitoring, which have the potential to enhance disease management and monitoring, the researchers wrote. The study, modeling multiple sclerosis using mobile and wearable sensor data, was published in NPJ Digital Medicine. They say weekly measurements found useful to monitor MS patients' activity. To guide treatment decisions in MS, it's necessary to have standardized methods to track the progression of disability and disease activity. Traditionally, this has been done by having patients regularly come into hospitals or clinics for evaluations by experts. However, such data collection is time-consuming, subjective, and only captures a sliver of a patient's actual experiences. very true with anyone, and I think particularly with those of us with MS, because our symptoms can vary so widely, day to day or even hour to hour. In recent years, as smart devices have become more commonplace, many scientists have begun to explore the usefulness of measurements taken by worn smartphones or smart watches, such as heart rate, step count, or, when the device is handheld, even patterns of tapping on the screen. The idea is that such data might be used to monitor MS in a way that's more holistic and less cumbersome for patients. Now, a team of scientists in Zurich conducted a battery of analyses that aimed to lay the groundwork for future efforts in this area. The goal was to identify which specific kinds of measurements from smart devices are more likely to provide meaningful data in MS. For these analyses, the team used data collected over the course of more than a year from 55 people with MS and 24 individuals without the disease who served as controls. In a first series of calculations, the scientists looked at 47 different device-based measurements to assess their reliability, that is, whether the measurements were consistent over time. The results showed that, when taken on a day-to-day basis, only 18 of the device-based measurements were reliable. However, when the measurements instead were considered on a weekly basis, almost all of them, 41 of 47 or 87%, met reliability criteria. The researchers said this is likely because people are often more or less active on certain days of the week on a routine basis. For example, someone who works at a desk all day on Tuesdays might go for a run on Wednesdays, with such weekly routines tending to be fairly stable over time. This suggests that measurements taken to monitor MS will generally be more useful if tracked on a weekly rather than a daily basis. The team also noted that data measured automatically by worn devices, such as step count, were more reliably collected over time than were data requiring patients to open an app and complete a specific test. We've already discussed how I would agree with that, just knowing myself as I do. Patients with more disability found to have lower step counts and heart rates. Next, the scientists looked for correlations between device-based measurements and standard measures of disability. Several statistically meaningful associations were found, among them that patients with more pronounced disability generally had lower step counts, lower heart rates, less physical activity, and less speed when tapping on the screen. And this is interesting to me because I think this is what we would assume, right? I think if someone were to ask you this question, you would say, well, of course. But what this is doing is using actual data to prove that it is true. And what I like about that is that a lot of times I'm not really sure how well we are believed when we say that this is how we are and this is how we're feeling and this is what our limitations are. But when the data actually shows it, perhaps there's going to be an easier time of it for us to persuade or to get the support that we need, because we're going to actually be seen as credible observers of our own condition. And it's sad to say, we aren't always. In proof of concept machine learning models, the scientists showed these device-based measures could be used to distinguish between people with or without MS. They could also be used to predict which type of MS a patient had, and also determine the likelihood of disability severity and fatigue with reasonable accuracy. Well, I don't know. Is that something that you'd want to know, or perhaps you wouldn't want to know? I'd be interested to hear your opinion on it. I am not sure myself if I'd want to know or not. Part of me would, and part of me kind of wouldn't. Our findings present exciting possibilities for monitoring MS in real-life situations, the researchers wrote. Overall, they concluded that these results indicate the clinical utility of features derived from mobile and wearable sensor data for monitoring MS disability and fatigue aspects, as well as distinguishing between people with MS and healthy controls. These findings can serve as guidelines for both medical researchers and clinicians to identify the type of data to be used for MS monitoring in real-world scenarios, the team wrote. And I'm thinking as I'm reading this, I'm thinking that, well, between you and your physician, you could probably decide which variables are most important for you, which ones seem to be the most reliable for you over time, because they may not be the same as anyone else's. And that's what I like about this kind of an application, because it might be able to be customized for what's really important for each individual person. That's my hope anyway. So here we are, Multiple Sclerosis News today, an article that was posted March 27th, 2024. Eye tracking device for monitoring MS severity approved in Canada. Use of Aetna MS will help make it easier to monitor disease progression. So only if you're in Canada can you get this with approval, but I'm hoping that this is the beginning of getting it approved in a more widespread way. Because once again, what this looks like to me is the patient getting to participate in their own MS monitoring and care, which is all to the good. And the article says that Health Canada has approved the commercial use of Aetna MS, a software-based medical device that uses eye tracking to non-invasively measure disease severity in people with multiple sclerosis. Now, you got to admit, this is a new thing. We all know we have vision issues, but I never thought that you could use looking at my eyes to tell how my disease was going. So let's see what they have to say. Short for Eye Tracking Neurological Assessment for Multiple Sclerosis, Aetna MS assesses the disease severity based on a person's eye movements. It's intended for use by doctors at the clinic, but also for self-testing at home, according to its developer, Engl Neurosciences. Engl says the eye tracking device will make it easier overall to monitor disease progression among MS patients. As far as we know, this is a world first that we hope the Canadian MS community will embrace for optimal management of people living with MS, Mark Reeves, Chief Business Officer at Engl, said in a company press release. No information was provided on how or when the newly approved device will be made available to patients in Canada, which has one of the highest rates of MS of any country across the globe. And you've seen that if you've watched my video about where MS is prevalent, that North America, and particularly Canada, has a lot of people with MS. Use of eye tracking device may help improve disease management. Engl, which originally designed the digital biomarker technology, teamed up with Novartis Canada in 2021 to further develop Aetna MS, extending the partnership in a multi-million-dollar agreement last year. Novartis Canada, for its part, welcomed the regulatory decision. This approval brings us one step further in closing the gap in care for people living with MS and marks a shift to a more proactive approach to disease management, Aaron Keith, Vice President of Neuroscience at Novartis Canada, said in a separate press release. And I think most of you are familiar with Novartis. They are a huge pharmaceutical company, and they have a lot of money to invest, but they also expect to make a lot of money back. So that is actually encouraging in a way. If the big pharmaceutical companies are interested, it must show a lot of promise. We are taking innovation in MS beyond the therapeutics, paving a path to much-needed solutions, Keith added. In MS, the immune system launches mistaken inflammatory attacks that damage the myelin sheath, a fatty substance that surrounds and protects nerve cells. This drives progressive nerve cell damage over time. Such attacks can also affect the nerves that supply the eyes, leading to subtle changes in eye movements that are not readily detected with available imaging techniques. The Aetna MS software aims to capture these changes as a way of better monitoring disease progression and resulting cognitive problems earlier in the course of a person's MS. That would allow patients to make more rapid treatment decisions as their condition progresses, according to the developers. And yes, I like that idea. I'm also really interested in, again, the use of computing technology that is so much better at detecting minute differences than humans are, and that is a shame, but it's true. Paul Giacomin, MD, Chief Medical Officer at Inodem, said the approval brings us one step closer to giving clinicians a tool that could help inform better clinical decision-making and offer more positive outcomes for patients. We've learned a lot about MS and its progressive nature over the years, but we still hadn't established a reliable and accessible means through which to monitor subtle changes in disease status in near real time, Giacomin said. Aetna MS could be used by patients at home, and to me, that's actually the beauty of it. Aetna MS software is designed to be run on standard iPad Pro tablets, which patients use to perform a series of simple visual tasks lasting less than 10 minutes in total. Those tasks are designed to assess key neurological functions known to be impacted by MS. During the test, the software extracts and analyzes hundreds of different parameters related to eye movements and gaze, applying artificial intelligence-based algorithms to interpret what they mean in terms of disease severity and cognition. From its analysis, Aetna MS will predict a person's score on the Expanded Disability Scale, or EDSS, a standard tool for evaluating MS functional disability and disease progression in the clinic. The EDSS scale runs from 0, indicating no disability, to 10 for death due to MS, with increasing degrees of functional disability in between. Aetna MS is designed to predict EDSS scores from 1, reflecting minimal functional changes in one domain, to 4.5, where disability is significant and somewhat limiting, but a person still has daily independence. In a validation study, the software was found to accurately assess disease severity and cognitive status among MS patients. Ultimately, the companies believe the output from Aetna MS can help doctors detect subtle signs of disease progression that might not be captured using imaging tests or available blood-based parameters, assessing clinicians in making more effective treatment decisions, and also allowing the patient to participate in the data gathering process, which I think is incredibly helpful. It also gives patients an easier way to evaluate their health status without having to visit the clinic. We believe that remote self-testing could improve the efficiencies of the healthcare system and extend this capability to people living with MS residing in rural areas who cannot easily access a specialist, said Etienne de Villiers-Sidani, MD, founder and CEO of Inodem. Diego Mena Martinez, executive director of the Quebec division of MS Canada, called the approval a sign of progress. When someone is diagnosed with MS, it changes their life, Martinez said. It can be a challenging condition to manage given its unpredictable nature, so I welcome the progress happening in this space as an important step toward a more proactive care approach, which has the potential of positively impacting people living with this disease. Aetna technology is also being evaluated for use in other neurodegenerative indications, including Friedreich's ataxia, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease. And of course, we have to recognize there are still issues and challenges which this article is going to address for us. This article was just recently posted in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's called Key Issues as Wearable Digital Health Technologies Enter Critical Care. So this is kind of a study that's looking across the board at what's being used in the way of wearable technologies and how that's going, how effective it is, but also what are the challenges that still remain to be addressed in order to make sure that this is really something that we want to have as part of our regular clinical care. I'm not going to read the whole article because it's very long. I will link it below, and I highly recommend that you read it if you're interested because it's quite comprehensive and raises some interesting issues. But I think that what we'll do for this video is just kind of cover the highlights. And as they say here, wearable digital health technologies, or DHTs, offer the potential to affect healthcare by making behavioral and physiological patterns in daily life outside the clinic visible to patients and medical professionals. And I think it is important to use these things. But again, there are challenges. As they go on to say here, the evidentiary basis for the broad clinical effect of wearable DHTs in these areas is in its infancy, but our series has shown the potential for real-world medical benefits. Well-designed longitudinal trials will show which of these transformative aims can be realized. In this final review in the series on wearable DHTs, we highlight important challenges that must be met in order to integrate the devices into clinical guidelines and practice. We have deliberately grounded our narrative in what is possible today, but we also speculate about specific uses of wearable DHTs in the future. So that's something to keep in mind. They're going to focus more on what they already know is being used and tried, but they also know that in the future, other things will be developed. And so what might that look like? Some of us are visual, so here's a figure that illustrates basically what they're looking at. Wearable digital health technologies, or DHTs. And in this inner circle, you can see not only what kinds of things they're looking at, but what conditions they've looked at, because some things have had clinical trials already and others have not. So they've been using them for diabetes, for epilepsy, for depression, and for heart failure. And out of these studies, here are the issues that they've already identified need to be addressed. So if we look at the outer circle, there are issues of data ownership. And that's a very important one, really. When you think about it, when the data is collected, who owns it? In theory, it should be your data, right? I mean, it came from you, so it should be your data. But there are others who also would lay a claim to owning your data. And this is a different thing than access to your data, right? You might give people access to your data, but that doesn't mean they own it. So this is a bigger issue. Does the institution or the doctor that's providing your care own your data? Does the company that owns the technology, the smartwatch, the smartphone, whatever, do they own your data? As you can see, it's not a simple issue. Another issue that they're looking at is patient access, literacy, and trust. This is huge. First of all, it is quite evident not everybody's going to have access to these technologies. Now, in some cases, they might be provided. They are often provided if you're in a clinical trial, but if not, you may have to acquire this yourself and hope that your insurance company will cover the cost. And we'll get to that in a minute. That's another issue. But access may just not even be there. Another thing is when they say literacy, they mean technological literacy. If you're not comfortable using a smartphone, or if you're not really familiar with how you use one of these smartwatches, it could be very difficult for you. And if you're not comfortable with something, the chances of you continuing to use it regularly are decreased. I won't say they go to zero, because I think some people are really good at picking up new things. But let's face it, the comfort level may not be there, so it might be more of a challenge for a patient to be adherent. And then finally, trust, and that's all wrapped up in these previous two. I have to trust what people are going to be doing with my data. I have to trust that the results that are being collected are accurate. I have to trust many things. And maybe I will, and maybe I won't. So that is an issue that needs to be looked at. Another issue is standards and interoperability, and I think that's something that we don't often think about from a patient perspective, except when it hits us in the face. There needs to be a standard for not only how it's used, but how these different instruments communicate across the board. So if the first time I'm using an app or a smartwatch with this technology on it is, say, in a hospital in, say, Los Angeles, and then I move to, say, London, am I going to be able to continue to use this piece of equipment that I've been using? Are the data even going to be comparable? Are they readable? Whatever. So that all of those things need to be standardized, and they need to operate pretty universally. And if you know much at all about technology, they're not real big on that. How often have you bought a printer and it takes a certain ink that has a certain number, and then you have to get a new printer? You know you're not going to find one that uses the same ink. So if you have a whole pile of ink that you've stockpiled, it's no good to you anymore. But something like this that your health depends on, this issue is even more important. Another issue is integration into clinical environments. Okay, well, how well will this really translate into a clinical environment? First of all of the people on your team need to be on board with the idea. They need to be familiar with it. They need to know how to use it. They need to know how to advise you how to use it. They need to know how to interpret the data when they get it. There's a lot to this, and a lot of folks might just as soon continue doing things the way they've always done it and not rely on this stuff. So that is a barrier, more on the medical side than not. But it is something I think patients can influence if they ask about it, if they talk it up, if they ask, could I possibly be considered for one of these devices? Would you support me if I were to get one? Those are good and important things a patient can do to get their medical team on board with the idea. And then other challenges, patient empowerment and agency. And I guess, this one is important too. Once the initial signing on to use the thing is once the patient agrees that they will sign on and use this thing, they need to feel like it's their process, that they're not just being experimented on or controlled by some outside force, that this is something that they really feel is useful for them, and that they are engaged in it to the point where they feel like, they have agency. And that's something that we are learning to do. In the past, you'd go into the doctor and they would pretty much tell you, well, this is what I think you have and this is what we're going to do about it. And, really, you kind of went along. But I don't know. We're not really in that state anymore. We're not in that stage of life anymore. I think doctors are more comfortable, for the most part, with having those kinds of conversations. But the patient needs to be sure to do their part. And then finally, and this is a big one, reimbursement and return on investment. So the first one, reimbursement, is again from the patient and the medical team's perspective. Will the insurance companies cover this, and to what extent? And what kind of proof do they need before they'll reimburse it? It's a whole different thing, I suppose, although you would think it'd be similar to a pacemaker, and those are covered by many plans. So I don't know, but there are probably going to be issues as new technologies are developed. And then return on investment, again, that's for the developer of the application. If they're not seeing widespread adoption, they're not going to be getting a lot of money back for the developmental costs that they've incurred to create this technology in the first place. So even though you might just totally love that app or that smartwatch app, it may not matter because the company that developed it isn't getting any profit out of it. So why bother continuing to support it or invest in it? So those are really the challenges that this article identified. And I think they're good ones. There's likely to be others. If you can think of some that aren't covered here, let me know. I'm very curious. Finally, I'm just going to read the conclusions of the article. Our premise, they say, is that in the realm of medical innovation, wearable DHTs are likely to shift the way health and disease are observed and managed. As engineers know, better controllability comes with better observability. Operators of vehicles drive better when they can see. Data sets from wearable DHTs provide observations of physiological and behavioral patterns in real life which have previously been unavailable to clinicians. These new data insights may help to foster a proactive and adaptive healthcare framework that can better fit an individual patient, providing earlier prevention and tailored treatments in line with a vision of precision health. expanded use of wearable DHTs has started to catalyze a redefinition of traditional healthcare roles. Patients are inspired by their data to be better personal health managers, and providers can receive health-relevant objective data about patient activities outside the clinic. As we contemplate the opportunity and potential promise of wearable DHTs, however, new challenges arise. Providers are largely unequipped to manage or understand the massive new sets of data. They will need to understand the benefits and limitations of AI-generated outputs, as well as the extent to which insights from wearable data are clinically meaningful, since some device alerts may cause superfluous use of healthcare. Investments are needed to educate clinicians and patients in the appropriate handling of data from wearable devices. Most important, work must be done to keep wearable DHTs from widening the digital divide. Addressing disparities in access and proficiency with these technologies is paramount if we are to advance health equity while improving the quality of health care. Quantifying the return on investment for wearable DHTs in terms of both clinical outcomes and economic efficacy across the whole health ecosystem remains a vital task. To address and solve these challenges will require the collective will and collaboration of a large stakeholder community, including healthcare providers, users, and wearable DHT developers. If we are to realize the full promise of data from wearable DHTs in facilitating early interventions and advancing precision healthcare for all people. As you probably know, I am not the first one to run out and be the early adopter of anything. But as far as these kinds of things go, I would like to think that I would see the benefits of and could be talked into using a smartphone app for monitoring my multiple sclerosis. I would be interested in knowing more about that. These articles really don't get down to the nitty-gritty of how it looks and what you do and what's involved and etc. But I'm curious to know more. And I would also curious to know if you're interested in knowing more. Is this something that you would be interested in being a part of? Would one or more of the concerns that the New England Journal of Medicine article brought up be a showstopper for you? Or do you see that this is inevitable and there's not much we're going to be able to do about it? It's a brave new world, right? But that's all I have for you today. So until I see you again in my next video, please take really good care of yourself and keep your general health just as strong as you possibly can, so that when these new developments come along, as they will, we're ready to tackle them head on.